Welcome to the Holding Time podcast, where we share inspiring stories from remarkable mothers who participated in the Holding Time project in Bradford. Each episode, we explore their unique breastfeeding stories, the highs, the lows, the challenges and the triumphs. Whether you're expecting, a new parent, or simply curious, we invite you to hear from these resilient warrior women as they share their experiences. Find out more at holdingtime.org.
I've breastfed all three of mine, and I've had really different experiences, certainly with Reuben, my first little boy. Breastfeeding him was a real challenge. I thought he was latching fine, but I don't know, in hindsight now, having breastfed two more babies, maybe he wasn't actually latching perfectly. He seemed a very happy little baby, and I was solely breastfeeding. We got into the swing of things, but then there was a constant, he's not meeting the growth charts, and he's not putting on weight. He was a very long baby, if that makes sense. I'm very tall, and he was very long. So I was less worried to begin with, because I was like, he's just distributing his weight a little bit differently. But you get the constant, maybe just top him up with formula, or he's maybe not getting enough. And it got to the point where I was having to meet the health visitor quite a lot and the doctor quite a lot, because they were concerned about his weight. And I hired one of those like industrial pumping things. I'd breastfeed him and then I'd pump, and we'd constantly go on that kind of circle, so he was having a bit of extra top up. And then we got thrush, and that was just a nightmare. And so there was just one thing after another that sort of compounded it into being this thing that I was just obsessing about quite a lot. People mean well, don't they? They're like, give yourself a break, give him a bottle. But when you're really trying to make breastfeeding work, it's kind of not what you want to hear. You kind of just want someone to bring a bit of cake and a cup of tea and say, just relax, and you'll be able to pump more than half an ounce.
I think that's true generally in life, isn't it, when you're struggling, that you don't want people to be prescriptive with their advice. Because also then if you don't follow the advice, you sort of feel like they're upset at you, like you disagree with them, or...
Yeah, exactly. It's just another pressure, isn't it? So yeah, that was really tricky. But actually, once he started eating solids as well, we managed to get rid of the thrush, and he started eating solids and putting the weight on better. And it all worked out. And we breastfed till about 14 months before we stopped. I don't know, I feel quite guilty about stopping breastfeeding with Reuben. Reuben, when he breastfed, he would breastfeed for, like 40 minutes. It was a proper comfort to him, as well as being like a food source. Whereas Emmett, my second son, he was really efficient. 10 minutes, he'd get what he needed, and then that's it. See you later, Mum. I'm off doing something else. So stopping breastfeeding with Emmett, my youngest boy, was, literally I just stopped one day and didn't offer it again. And that was it. He wasn't bothered at all. He didn't even ask for it again. So I think it was me sort of, wanting to carry that on. Whereas with Reuben, it was a lot stopping with him. But we'd got to sort of 14, 15 months, and I paid too much attention to other people's opinions and advice. And I think if I'd to go back, I wouldn't have stopped until he was ready, rather than, at the point at which I thought everybody else saw him as being ready.
Who influenced you in that situation? Was it generally like just people looking at you in a funny way, or was it specifically like people around you thought you should?
No, I think people around more than anything. You know what I mean? I'm not necessarily one to take note of somebody, saying something in the street, or giving you a dirty look or whatever in the street. But a lot of my family and some of my friends were like, oh well, he's old enough now and he's getting what he needs from food, and maybe if you stop breastfeeding as much he'll sleep a bit better, and all the things that now as a mum of three I'm like, just turn them off, just Like, you know best.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, the public are being educated, aren't they, by formula
Yeah.
companies that are advertising formula from 6 months. So that is a form of public health education, whether we like it or not. It's done by private companies, and those companies are advocating to parents and the wider community that you don't need breast milk after 6 months. So
Yeah.
if you fed 8 months beyond that, people are already thinking, well, you've done far more than you need to.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because there isn't another campaign, another education campaign that says, you need to feed a baby for a couple of years and then as long as you can. There's no counter information. So people just have the information that they've got, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. If I could go back to bringing Reuben up now, having the confidence that I've got and the sort of, confidence in my own ability more than anything else, I do think that'd do me the world of good. But you are where you are.
Did you feed Emma for longer than 14 months then?
He was a little bit longer, but I think because he was so like not bothered at all, we stopped at a similar point. But it had got to the point where we were just having a little nighttime feed anyway. And like I said, it was more for me than for him in a weird sort of way. I enjoyed that closeness with him, but actually he wasn't really bothered, and he would often like come on and off. And yeah, so when I'd sort of, decided like the time is right now, like I knew it was right because he was, completely unfazed by it.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it, that you can have three babies and observe these differences in them because you've had three. And I
Yeah.
suppose a lot of the reason we've lost expertise in breastfeeding is because women just have fewer children.
Yeah.
So, like, even three, you're kind of an expert. If you have four, you're like at genius level, aren't you?
No, we're done.
But I'm just saying, I've interviewed women who've had four children, and your level of like knowledge about it. But actually, I do have a friend who has had 10 children.
Oh, wow.
And when I talk to her about breastfeeding, it's really very interesting because the main thing she emphasizes is how different it is with every child.
Yeah.
Just the circumstances, like when you say about Emmett being a fast feeder and that he was happy to end breastfeeding at that age, sort of suggests that he was kind of like quite capable of feeding from the beginning. Like children have different strength in their tongue and their mouth and their jaw, and all of that really influences whether or not they grow or put on weight or, like you say, are efficient.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not really anything you've done differently, is it?
No, that's it. Yeah, it's bizarre. And Emmett was, he was a proper chubby little thing. He was on the top end of all the growth charts.
Was there any difference in their births? Was it
No,
different?
not really.
No. Interesting. And were you breastfed?
I was, yeah. And my mum was very, she was very sort of, she definitely wanted to breastfeed both of us. But she was also very much up to 6 point, and then that is it. At 6 months, she stopped. So.
And what year were you born in?
So I was 84, baby.
Right. I mean, that was quite unusual for 84, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That was definitely sort of the height of formula because I was telling someone the other day about when I was 10, which would have been 1980 or 81, 82. That's when I actually discovered there was such a thing as breastfeeding. When I found out about it, I thought people were pulling my leg,
Yeah.
And then my mum showed me a picture of a woman breastfeeding, and it's so funny thinking about it, but I was really disgusted.
Yeah.
I found it really, really weird.
We had a similar chat in the writing groups. She had us talk about the first time we can remember breastfeeding. I got onto a train with a woman who was breastfeeding her older toddler, and it was sort of the first time I'd ever seen breastfeeding full stop, let alone breastfeeding an older baby. So I was the same. And thinking back on it now, I'm ashamed of the way I felt. But I guess societal upbringing is just you don't see it around. And I guess if you're not seeing it, and I often get it from kids in the park, I'll take my boys to the park after school, and often I'll have to sit there breastfeeding her, and there's some children that will come up and, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Why have you not got a bottle? And are really confused by it. And yet Emmett, because he's been around it so much, he's got his shirt up and he's feeding his doll. Oh, my baby's hungry, mummy. So you're like, yeah, it's just what you're exposed to, I think. And it's just
Yeah, of
quite,
course.
like, I find it quite sad that it's not something that we're all sort of exposed to more. There's always babies on the telly, in adverts or on soaps or whatever, and they're all sat there with a bottle. It's really rare that you see women breastfeeding their children.
It was an unusual aspect of an IKEA ad recently.
How was it?
Yeah, there was a mother, it was like, the new nursery and stuff, and she was sitting in the middle breastfeeding.
Oh,
But
brilliant.
even then, it's always a baby. And
Yeah.
so there's no understanding of this later phase of breastfeeding, which might be from 1.5 onwards, which is it is very important for children, but it suffers from very poor visibility and is poorly understood. There's a dearth of research.
Yeah.
So yeah, as a mother, though, you sort of can sense whether a child wants to continue breastfeeding. Well, certainly that's what mothers have said to me, and that's how I felt.
Yeah.
I feel like it gets really difficult being told that you should stop because you feel like people are interfering in something. Yeah, going back to what we were saying earlier about prescriptive advice, it starts to become more like a judgment, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Do you breastfeed in public? Do you feel
I do,
okay doing that?
I do. And I feel, it's very different this time round than it has been with my sons. I mean, to be honest, Emmett was a lockdown baby, so nobody did a lot of public anything.
Yeah.
But with Reuben, I certainly felt very conscious of it. And I was constantly like, oh gosh, what am I going to wear that's going to like not show any flesh when I feed them, and where can I sit? And I'd position myself in coffee shops so that I was like turned away from people. And I remember there was this one time in this one particular coffee shop, and of course when they get to a certain age where, I mean, she's sort of past it a bit now, but sort of 4 or 5 months, they know it's coming, so they make like the most noise possible just when you're about to get your boob out. Which
just to let everybody know that might not be interested to look in your direction.
Yeah, exactly. On time, you don't want everybody to look at you. She'll just make the most noise ever. And Reuben had done that in this coffee shop. There was this old man, bless him, and he obviously looked over just as I was trying to latch him on. And it was really early days, so we were still trying to find the latch. And he just, I don't know, he just had this look, and Reuben was getting really upset. And I couldn't latch him on properly without getting my boob properly out, basically. And I didn't want to do that. So I ended up covering myself up, shoving him in the pram and just getting out of there. And I went and sat in the car and just fed him and cried. I think it's the confidence thing, isn't it? Like now in that situation, it's nothing I'd ever do. I'm still, not necessarily confident enough to just properly embrace getting my boob out. Which I'd love to be, but I'm not that person. But I certainly wouldn't ever, be ashamed of what I was doing.
Yeah.
I think in those early days with Reuben, I did sort of have a bit of that.
It's difficult when you don't quite know what you're doing anyway. I mean, it's quite a big learning curve. And then to have people you don't know look at you skeptically while you're attempting this thing that you're possibly not actually very good at, at that stage. It's a bit of a performance.
Yeah, well, neither of you are. You and baby, you're not very good at it. So it is really difficult.
And it can be misinterpreted possibly by some people, not I wouldn't generalize with different generations, because I find also some older people were, when I was breastfeeding, the most supportive,
Yeah. I mean, I had an instance in the park, and I'd sat on this bench while the boys were riding up and down on the bench and was feeding her, and this old lady just came and sat next to me, and she was like, that is absolutely beautiful, I'm so glad you're feeding her yourself. And she just had a chat to me and then talked about her daughters and how she breastfed them, and I was like, that's it, isn't it? That's what you need in those situations almost.
I think what we need is a different verb for the act that we're doing, because I think the term breastfeeding, there's debate about it, certainly in terms of making it accessible to people who give birth who don't identify as female. There's this sort of mention of the term chest feeding, but that's sort of like is a similar kind of term, but without the breast, which I think is
Yeah,
not a good replacement.
unhelpful.
And then we have the term human milk for what it is that's coming out of the breast, but what we don't have is a good word for what we're doing. I mean, maybe human feeding, but that sounds weird. It sounds like you're feeding them bits of arms and legs. But we need a new verb, you know. I think one that isn't so, it's sort of less sexualized
Yeah,
and
100%. Yeah,
less physical and a bit more kind of honors it in a different kind of way, you know? Like when
yeah,
you say she described it as you feeding your baby yourself, like that's just such a nice way of summarizing what you're doing, independent of any other industrial food complex or whatever.
yeah,
You're feeding your child, and that is a person to person, mother to child act of love, or and it's got this nice tone to it that I think breastfeeding lacks, you know? It's a bit mechanical, isn't it?
oh yeah, totally.
In a fleshy sort of way.
Yeah, it's nourishment, isn't it? Like they are getting their nourishment from you.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. Like some sort of like different term for it would be.
Yeah, nourishment's a good one. Like if it could be something nourishing, you know, like oh, I don't know. But anyway, I think we need some new words around it. I think that would help. A bit of a rebrand, you know?
Yeah, totally.
Is there more that we could be doing to make it easier for mothers that want to breastfeed?
Oh, definitely, I think. Yeah, I think I've been really fortunate in that my births and experiences in hospital with the NHS have been wonderful on the most part, particularly with the breastfeeding support that I've had. You know, I was fortunate enough with both the boys to be able to stay overnight in my own little room with the boys. And, you know, there was a nurse or a health visitor there as soon as I'd ring the bell if I couldn't latch them on properly. And, you know, that level of support, particularly with Reuben, with my first, was so like appreciated. I don't really know how I'd have managed without that. And I think after, you know, you come home as well, there's that level of support initially from the midwife. You know, the midwife would come, and the midwives I had were very helpful in checking my latch properly. And but then it suddenly sort of drops off a cliff when it's almost the time when you need it the most. You sort of get to the point where your milk started to come through and you're past the point at which the midwives are coming to visit, and you're suddenly at this point where your nipples are bleeding and like blistered and your boobs are enormous, and you know you just want somebody to come and tell you that you're doing it right, and there isn't that support there. And you know, with Reuben, we at least had the health visitor place just up the road, and they run a session every Wednesday. So I could go along and they would check my latch, and you know, you could see other mothers. And you know, that turned into a little bit of an obsession because we ended up on the scales every week, which then wasn't necessarily great because you were checking the blooming curves all the time. But some sort of support after those initial midwife visits, you know, because your midwives stop coming at whatever it is, day 5, and then you don't see the doctor till 8 weeks. And I can imagine it's that window where women just stop because it's too much.
I think that is when the statistically, you know, it's only 50% of women that initiated breastfeeding are still breastfeeding at that
Yeah.
point. And if you consider that maybe it might be 70 to 75% of women that might initiate, I mean, the data is a bit, possibly a little bit suspect sometimes because you have to feed a baby to leave hospital. So sometimes people are feeding formula when then they might actually ultimately try breastfeeding. And then also some people might try breastfeeding and then go to formula. So it's quite hard to know whether is the initiation rates are all that accurate.
Yeah.
I think that figure at 6 weeks is probably quite accurate, which is, or I think it might be is it 3 to 4 or is it 6 weeks? But yeah, that's when it's noted again that a large proportion of people who started have stopped.
Yeah. And I can understand why, because it's bloody hard. You know, it's so hard, and you're already trying to recover from birth, and you know, now you're trying to do this extra thing. It's like what you said, you know, it's an extra skill that you're both trying to learn. And, you know, with external pressures, just because of the society, oh, well, just give them a formula, just give them a bottle, make it a bit easier for yourself. Like, the way I see breastfeeding is that, frankly, I'm lazy. I don't want to be getting up in the middle of the night, making a bottle of formula however many times I need to, or carrying God knows what with me every time I go out anywhere. Like, once you've got it down and you and your baby are in tune, obviously there's a million other benefits to breastfeeding, but it is genuinely easier. You don't have to faff and listen to your baby scream while you're waiting for your milk to heat up. And yeah, so I often say to people, I'm just lazy. I want to keep breastfeeding because it is so much easier. And I just think, like, none of those positives are ever talked about. And, that along with the whole, like, society outlook on breastfeeding, like what I said before, we see bottles, every bloody doll that's on sale is on sale with a bottle. It's just trying to make that a bit more visible, and a bit more normalized, I guess. And like you said, from sort of 6 months and beyond as well.
How would we do that though? Any thoughts?
A lot of it could come from things like the television. These people that are making these shows could feature breastfeeding stories and breastfeeding women at different age of children. There's babies and toddlers and all sorts of families displayed on these shows. I mean, personally, I don't watch soaps, mainly because I don't have time to watch soaps, but lots of people do. That'd be a way to get it out there more. I think some form of education for children would be really beneficial. Why can't breastfeeding mothers go into schools? And I mean, God, it'd be absolutely, I can imagine the uproar now.
It's a great idea.
Breastfeeding mothers could go into schools and, talk about their stories and talk about how they're feeding their baby. And, it is ultimately all anatomy, and it would give children that exposure so that, they're not sat on a train at, 12 or whatever and horrified by the woman sat next to them breastfeeding their toddler.
Children are the place to make change, probably, aren't they? Because they're unprejudiced.
Yeah, there's a couple of kids' books that we've got for the boys that feature women feeding their babies, breastfeeding their babies, which is nice. But, seeing more of that in children's books would be great way to get information to them.
Yeah, that's true. That's really interesting set of thoughts about schools and children. I know that the Royal College of Paediatricians suggested that there should be child education of breastfeeding, and there was, you can imagine what the Mail had to say. But I mean, it's obviously a good idea, isn't it? Because it sets up an expectation. And I think when you put those expectations in really early, they set really deep. So in the same way as if we put in low expectations early, they're really hard to get over when we're older, whatever they're about, whether it's that I can swim or I can run my own business, or, there's all this focus on all these other things that we want children to expect of themselves. But that it would also really help with normalizing it, whether or not you can breastfeed, whether or not you have a good experience of breastfeeding. It would normalize it so the people around you sort of feel comfortable with the idea of it, if children were educated.
Yeah.
Sort of create an environment where that's the expectation and the norm.
Yeah.
I feel like we're still quite a long way off from that, to be honest. Possibly a generation away from it. We're possibly another generation away from it.
Yeah, I think so. I would say at least, to be honest. They've been debating the whole, having sex education, haven't they, in schools, and how that comes across. So I can imagine this would have a similar backlash to a certain extent. But that's almost the problem, isn't it? Because people of that generation that make the decisions see it as something that, it's not. It's a mother, like, nourishing her child.
Like you say, it's anatomy, as is sex education. I mean,
exactly, yeah.
I think the era where we didn't educate children about sex is the era when there was a lot of abuse of children.
100%, yeah.
You make children vulnerable, basically, by not educating them. I don't know what the advantages are of keeping them ignorant, except that it helps predators prey on them more effectively because they don't know what's happening.
No, exactly.
So
that we've got a generation now that are very aware of their boundaries. That's because they had sex education. I mean, when you call it sex education, I don't know if it's really about sex so much as it's about like personal boundaries and some biology, like things like periods. I mean, girls are having periods a lot earlier because you do see that girls who are really well fed and taller and, you know, healthier as a result of like a good diet, they do end up maybe having periods earlier. And you know, they need to know about them. You can't have kids having periods not knowing what's happening to them. That's tragic. So they really do have to educate kids from 9 onwards, I think.
It's important for boys to understand what's
Totally. Yeah. There was a little boy in my daughter's class, and they did some great stuff around periods, and they were doing like putting coloured water onto a sanitary towel or something. And he said, "Oh, this is so cool. I wish I had periods." And if, you know, it's giving boys empathy and it's demystifying women's bodies, which I think then helps with misogyny. And, you know, because a lot of that comes from the fear of women's bodies. We want to raise nice boys, don't we?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you take care.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Goodbye, gorgeous. She seems to know, doesn't she?
Bye. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Holding Time podcast. We're grateful to everyone involved in this project, including our partners and funders, Bradford District Care Trust and Arts Council England and Better Place Bradford, and all the incredible mothers and families who made it all possible. For more information, visit holdingtime.org. The link is in the episode description. Please like, follow or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And consider sharing this podcast to help raise awareness and support for breastfeeding.